Well, my children both went to the school, and in my final year of my degree, I was interviewed by an inspector from Staffordshire in Burton at the old Guild Street offices, and he said, you will have a job somewhere in Staffordshire in September, but I don't know where. And then 2 weeks later, I had a phone call one morning at 9:10 from Mr. Hayton, who was the head then, to say, can you come round to the school, lass? And I rushed round thinking there was a problem with my children because I'd just dropped them off. And he said, I've got a job going in the reception class, would you like it? I'll give you a couple of weeks to think about it if you like. And that's how it started.
And so what did you think about that? Well, I mean, what did you think of the school when you obviously moved into the area? What was the school? Was this the old school then?
No, when we first moved to the area in 1970, my son wasn't at school, but my daughter Samantha was. And she was at the old school, which was, of course, a lovely setting and very different from Leeds, where we came from, which was a sort of, not an inner city school, but it was a modern school. And we thought it was lovely. And then they started building the new school, and my son was one of the first intake there. So he was, we were pleased with the new school because it was lovely. But, and so that's how I became involved. The children were there, and then I decided, I'd always wanted to teach, and I decided I would, when my son started, that I would ring up the university and say, do you offer any courses that would be suitable for someone who's married with children? And they said no, but come and talk to the Dean of Students and see what we can offer. So I went, and for what I thought was just a chat, and they wrote back and offered me a place. And so I couldn't drive then, so I had to quickly learn to drive. I had 3 months to learn to drive. And so that's how it all happened, really.
So obviously you've been there for a long time.
Yes, it will. Next year will be 40 years.
40 years. So
Yes.
40 years. Now, this is a massive question. And what was it like when you first started there? I mean, we can't say how things have changed because 40 years, a lot have changed. But if you could paint a picture what life was like at All Saints School when you first started there.
Well, when I first started, there were only 3 of us in the school. There was me, a Miss Naden, I was the reception, she was the next teacher, and Joy Rowe. And we were the only ones because it was just the infants, Key Stage 2, or the juniors as they were then, were all up at the old school. And so it was very different. It was a much smaller school. We didn't have things like teaching assistants. There was just one secretary worked there. So it was a very small community, really.
And now reception children are being pushed to be ever more academic. What was a typical day in terms of lessons like when you first started? What sort of things did you do with them?
I think we did everything that we do now, but we weren't so prescriptive, and we were led by the children's needs. We weren't being pushed by government or by outside agencies who were just dealing with figures. And I think that was the difference. For example, one day a child came in with an elephant's tusk, a whole elephant's tusk, and said, my daddy said, would you like this? And we did a week's work round this. Now, arguably, you couldn't do it nowadays because you've got a plan and you have to stick to the plan. Yeah. And I am involved with training a lot of students, and that's the one thing I notice. They can plan to the finest detail, but you watch them teach and they miss an opportunity where a child, you could have taken it off there because they don't want to go off plan. And that's the big difference. I think that intuitive teaching is a very important part of teaching. When I was doing my training, I read a book called The Philosophy of Education by a man called Dennis Childs. And he said, in teaching, it's important to be flexible, but you have to have something to be flexible with. And I think that was very true. I think we've gone slightly the other way now.
Yeah, there's a fear, isn't there, now of going off script, I think.
Yes, there is.
Which is very sad, I think.
And I think sometimes that
be played by a fly.
Yeah, is to the detriment of the children sometimes, which is so that's the big difference really.
You were telling me about the head teacher, Mr. Hayton, who was there. Could you recount that story for me about?
Yes,
his...
he was a very bluff Yorkshireman.
Could you, sorry, if you could start by saying Mr. Hayton.
Okay.
Say because the I'll chop that bit out about me talking. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Hayton was the first head. He was a very bluff Yorkshireman, and he called all the because it was only ladies who worked there. Mr. Shear was at the junior school, but he called us all lass. And he was a very plain speaking man. He actually said to me one day, I'd been doing some work with the reception class, and we were doing subtraction because we'd done addition and they were getting quite good. And when he saw now it was a record book rather than a focus book in those, a forecast book. So you wrote down what you had done that week. And I put that I'd been doing subtraction, and I was called into his office at the end of the week. And he said, right, lass, he said, I noticed you've been doing subtraction with them. I said, yes. He said, don't push them too far. They're only babies. And that was typical Mr. Hayton. We didn't see him very much. He never came out of his room, never came into the staff room, didn't do assemblies. He was a whiz with a screwdriver if something fell off the wall. But basically, it was him and us. And then when he decided to retire because he said education was going in a direction he didn't go into it for. And so he and his wife retired at the same time. And the governors, I was a governor then, and we decided to get Delise Sanders, who still lives in Mill End Lane, who was an artist, to do a picture for him. We commissioned a painting of all of us. And he refused to accept it because he said, I don't want any fuss. He said, I just want to go. And so he wouldn't accept. And the night he left, I'd worked with him probably for about 5 or 6 years. And I knocked on his door just to say, wishing you all the best. And he said, don't come in, lass. I don't want any sentiment. So he was only once did we get him to come into a Christmas concert. And he was actually quite overcome with emotion. And afterwards, I saw a different side of him. I thought that's why he doesn't come out.
So who followed him into the head's chair?
We had a very different head then called Mrs. Morris, who was very tiny. And on her first morning with us in September, all the staff were in the staff room. And by that time, the juniors had moved down as well. We'd had the extension built, and so the whole school was down there. And so we were all in the staff room, exactly the same staff room as we have now. But we were all in the staff room, and she sat at the end and she said, I would like you all to know that when decisions have to be made, I may ask your opinion, but at the end of the day, it is my school and it will be my decision. And we were all a little bit shell-shocked, really, after Mr. Hayton. But she was very efficient. You couldn't falter on that. She gave us all a huge file and said, that is the curriculum you will teach. Not sure it was ever opened, but by anybody.
Is that something she produced or brought
Yes,
in?
no, she produced it herself. But that's the way, she likes things done her way. Yeah. But she was very efficient. So she was quite different. She didn't stay terribly long because her husband was a headmaster, and he moved to Wales, and so with his job, and so she went with him.
So would it have been Mr. Hayden after that? Was he the next one? Or
Haddon.
Lyle
Haddon.
Yes.
Yes.
So what was he like? I mean, I knew him, but tell me about Lyle.
Yes. Lyle was what you might call a culture shock after Mrs. Morris. Whereas if you went into Mrs. Morris's room, there would be one file on the table, or one sheet of paper she was dealing with. When you went into Lyle Haddon's room, there was a whole heap of papers, and he could never find what he wanted. And he had a system, Lyle, that every so often he would clear his desk into the bin, because if it was important, they'd write again. So he was a very different kind of headmaster. I mean, unfortunately, fairly quickly he started to show signs of illness. and I think the school suffered during that period from lack of leadership. And what it taught me is how important strong leadership is. Because the atmosphere in the village and in the school was quite tense during that time.
Has the relationship between the school and the village changed much over the years that you've been working there? What is the relationship like?
I think in the early days, parents rarely questioned the school's decisions. They were more accepting, as I'm sure my mother was when I was at school. If the school said that's what you did, that's what you did. Now it's very different. I think education is more out there, and I think also, rightly or wrongly, parents are told you must do this and you must do that, or you mustn't do this and you mustn't do that, and they will readily question the school's decisions. So you have to be prepared and equipped to justify your decisions, which is right in a way. We should be justifiable.
Yeah. Sometimes maybe a little bit too much.
Yes. Well, it's very difficult sometimes because we're making decisions for educational reasons, and parents are making much more subjective decisions because it's their children, which are understandable. We all do when it comes to our children. We see things differently.
And do you think the children have changed much over the years, the children who go to the school?
Yes, I think they have. I think the children we have now have probably been had preschool education from a very early age. Whereas when I started, and for quite a long time, it was parents who dropped them off in the morning. And they came into school much more, not necessarily more educationally ready, but they were socially ready for school. They'd had a lot of play. I think that's when we go back to what we were saying earlier. Now it's all about, I think there is something intrinsically wrong about telling a parent when a child is 3, your child is not up to scratch. Because we all know that by 7, that situation could have changed tremendously. But parents get stressed by that because they think it's a sort of reflection upon them and their parenting.
Did you have, I know there were some links with, there used to be before it was stepping stones, it was nursery and playgroup.
Yes.
What links did you have with the nursery school at the time?
Well, actually, we were very lucky because there was an initiative that I think Paula was instrumental in developing to try and get those links, stronger links between the preschool and the school. And so for about 2 years, we set up an initiative where I would go every so often and I would spend half a day with the preschool. I used to go to evening sessions where I'd talk to parents so that I got to know them. And then we started that the half term before the children started at school, I would have them in with their playgroup helpers. For the ones who were starting would come for half a day a week to get to know me, and I got to know them, and so that by the time they started they were quite familiar with it. And so we had and I think we had a good relationship, and our children were invited to their Christmas concerts and summer concerts, and I used to go to the playgroup summer party and present the leaving books and things like that. And it was lovely. It was a lovely relationship with them, and I enjoyed that tremendously.
It seems to become more business-like now, doesn't it? Because the stepping stones has to make money, and school has to justify itself and make money as well, effectively.
Yes.
So I think that's strained the relationships, maybe.
But I think there are times when, perhaps sometimes we have to say, well, which is important? If it's important to build up those relationships to start with, perhaps we ought to try and make it happen.
I'm going to ask you a specific question. I interviewed Richard Kirkland.
Oh, yes.
Who said he hated school with a passion. Not because of any other reason than he just wanted to be out doing things. Do you remember teaching Richard?
I do remember teaching
Can you tell
Richard,
me what it was like?
Yes. He was a very quiet boy. Always very polite, very quiet, did as he was told, never put a foot wrong. But it was always very obvious that he wasn't sort of that wasn't his favourite place to be, shall we say. But he was certainly not, he wasn't disruptive or anything. He was one of those children who knew he'd got to come to school and he put up with it.
He told me he used to hate sitting on the dais, dais that you had.
Yes.
And he had great pleasure when they remodelled the room in
Yes.
coming and destroying that.
Yes. Yes, I bet he did.
Yeah, it wasn't anything personal. He said he couldn't see the point of it. But
No.
Are there any, I know it's a huge question to ask, but are there any standout moments that sort of leap to mind about, maybe it's particular children or members of staff or things that happened in school, trips or visits, or just nice things that happened that you can particularly jump to mind? I know it's a huge
Well, one of
question.
the very early ones is I took the reception class. Our topic had been dinosaurs, and I took them to Matlock Bath, because next to Gulliver's Kingdom was a big dinosaur park, which was I'd been to look at it, and I knew it would be good. But as part of the day, we went to Gulliver's Kingdom as well, and had a wonderful day. It was a day very hot and sunny, and on the way home, it was very quiet on the coach. And it was before the days of seatbelts, so that was always a nightmare on the journey, making sure the children were all in their seats. And because it was very quiet, I went down the coach and every child was fast asleep. Everyone. And they slept all the way home.
Oh, bless them.
But, I mean, in 40 years there have been so many. I mean, I feel very privileged that I've had so much involvement. For example, at the last school disco, a young man, one of our dads, came up to me and he said, "Hello, Mrs. Faircliff, I bet you don't remember me, do you?" I said, "I do, it's David Westwood." And he said, "Fancy you remembering me?" And
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, now you must be teaching grandchildren or possibly great-grandchildren.
children. No, it's children.
Just children.
Just
now,
children,
is it?
yes, children of people I taught. Because, of course, they were 5 when I had them. So now it's their children. And so there's quite a lot. Every class now, there are children who come and say, "You taught my mum or my dad."
And you taught, of course, reception for many years.
25 years.
Before you moved
Yes.
around,
Yes.
didn't you? So how did
I mean,
you find change?
the interesting thing is that in the first 20 years of my teaching, nobody ever watched me teach. Apart from the first year, somebody came in, an inspector came in, and never watched me teach. And that's the difference now. And then it was, we then had a head teacher, after Lyle Haddon left, we had a head teacher called Bernadette Hunter, who was, again, very efficient. She's now the president of the National Association of Head Teachers. And Bernadette was very efficient. And she said to me, "I'd like you to," I was then the early years coordinator, so she said, I'd like you to take over the literacy, and would you move to Key Stage 2? And I spent a summer going around every Roman site in England, because I knew I had to do the Romans. And the one thing I was worried about was the computer skills. And the teacher who was leaving, who was very good at it, said, "What you've got to remember in year 3, try the tack. I wonder if anybody knows," she said, "there's always somebody who knows more than you." And she was very right, so I thank her for that. But it has it's changed tremendously. Not all for the better. I think it's harder. I think it's a much harder job now. And I do think, I strongly believe that side of the teaching, which is a craft, they all know the science. They know how to plan, they know what all the standards are and all these sorts of things. But there's the other side of teaching, which is a craft and which is about children. And I think that one really needs to be reinstated.
It's all about results now, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Especially
I mean,
if
when
they're
Ofsted come, that's all they look at is the data, and they try to find what the data tells them.
Changing tack slightly, I've got some lovely films, and you will have seen them because Quentin was involved with them. The case of the disappearing chalk and so on. Can you tell me how that came about, who set it up, and if you have any memories of it?
Yes, it was Liz Bates and Pat Shear and I. And Liz was one of those inspirational teachers who just made a connection with children. When my son went into her class, I wasn't sure how he'd cope with Liz because he was quite quiet. And when he came home the first day, I said, "How do you get on with Mrs. Bates?" "Oh," he said, "she's great." And she said, "She can shout louder than you." So that was it. She'd made a hit with him. And Liz wanted to do the drama. She was very good at drama. She would write our Christmas plays. Pat Shear was one of the most inspirational teachers I've ever seen. He was an amazing man. He got the results, but he had the relationship with the children. And we decided, there was talk about it, because Quentin and I were involved in the drama, about having a drama club. Well, we ran it on a Saturday morning, because you couldn't do it after school in those days. We ran it on a Saturday morning. And it wouldn't be allowed nowadays. We'd take the children over Witchner Fields and all sorts of places. And John Colston got involved, which I'm sure you've got on the film. And
who decided to make them into films? Was Quentin he was the film chappie, was he?
No, he wasn't. No? It was in the early days of video cameras. Do you remember when there were huge things? And the school got one. We got a video camera, and so I think it was Pat Shear who wanted to who was keen to film it, and of course the children thought it was wonderful. In fact, in those films, I know the ones you're talking about, because James Walker, after Quentin died, gave me some copies of them. He put them onto CD for me. Yeah. But that was like a history of the school. When you looked at the classrooms, they were much duller than they are now.
My impression at looking at photographs of the school during the 80s particularly is it looked a bit tatty.
Yes, it did.
As well.
Yes. Well, it had the old wooden desks, which were getting very tired, because it had been open. It opened in 1972. So they were getting quite tatty by then, the wood. And everything was brown and dark and hard floors. There weren't carpets. And so when I saw those films, it struck me how colourful the school is now.
And what do you remember of the village generally? Because again, I've got some film of the village in the 70s, and a lot of buildings were quite tatty and dirty as well then. I think we see it as quite a clean, bright, well-kept village now. But do you remember how the village has changed over the years?
Well, I do, and also, I mean, there were at least 3 working farms in the village when we first came. And I remember driving to school in the mornings, and Tom Mellor, who we lived at that time in Essington Close, and Tom Mellor had the farm just at the back of Dark Lane. And he would be driving his cows down to his field, where Mellor Close now is. That was his field. And in the mornings, he would be driving the cows. So I just had to sit behind him and wait until the cows had gone. Well, you can imagine the state of the roads. So it has changed quite dramatically.
Are there any, I mean, you've mentioned some members of staff like Pat Shear, who I think everybody remembers. Are there any other members of staff or pupils that particularly, I mean, pupils is a huge ask because there are hundreds of them, aren't there? Any that particularly spring to mind that you remember?
Gosh.
It doesn't matter if you can't.
No, I think there are just so many of them. And so, I mean, there's a lovely story. There was a little girl called Kirsty Gold, whose children are at our school now. And I remember when Kirsty first came to school, it was the beginning of her first week, and it was playtime. And she said, I said, right now, you're going out to play. And she said, come on, Mrs. Faircliff. And I said, oh, it's not my turn. And she looked at me and she said, oh. And she went outside. I meant it's not my turn on yard duty. She went outside and she came running back and she said, you're all right, there's nobody there, come on. And it's those sorts of little... I mean, Quentin used to say to me, you ought to write these things down. And Gervais Finn has done exactly that. And when I hear his stories, they sound outrageous, but they're not. They are exactly what happens. Yeah. I can remember the nativity play when Mary and Joseph walked on the stage and Joseph sat down on the stool. Mary was left standing holding the baby at the side. And when my son was one of the kings in the infant nativity play, he was the third king. And as they were going up he was the second king. And as they were going up the steps with their gifts, the king behind him, who was David Croshaw, tripped. He fell into Jamie. Jamie fell into Adrian Allen, who was the king with the gold. And so all 3 of them sort of landed on the stage in a heap.
A comedy moment.
There were, yes. And there are so many. And they still happen now. You know, these... now, I think in Key Stage 2, you have a different relationship with the children as well. And I enjoy that now. I enjoy that sort of, their sense of humour is more sophisticated. And I think the children are generally much more sophisticated now.
Well, they have far more worldwide experiences than 30, 40 years ago, don't they? All the foreign travel and
absolutely
experiences,
yes.
Sort of going out and events
yes.
and activities they do.
Yes. Well, I was just listening to a radio programme about Laurie Lee, and they asked him about the changing nature of village life. And he said, in my youth, in the summer, people were out in the village. He said nowadays they want to watch EastEnders or Coronation Street. They've got television to watch. He said we didn't, so we went out. And I think, talking about changes in the village, the village hall was I know it is still quite instrumental, but, that was really quite important because not as many people had cars. So our first involvement with amateur dramatics was my first one. Quinton was involved in Leeds before we came. But
so what was your involvement with the Drama Society? I know.
Well, to start with, Quinton, as I say, when I first met him in Leeds, he was involved on the technical side of their drama group. Then when we came to Allrowas, the very first person we met was Audrey Hall, because Audrey was involved with a group called Welcome Wagon or something. She came round to tell us about the village and things. And when Quinton said he was involved, she said, we've got a drama society. And so she got him involved in Lichfield. And he also got involved in Allrowas, and he did acting and technical and did the lighting and things. And then when the village hall was refurbished the first time round, Quinton took on the role of coordinating it. And I remember the whole family, my son says he can remember being round there painting the village hall. Everybody had to go, and we got a group of people and used to go around. But there was a great feeling of community there, and it was ours. We had ownership of it.
I don't think people realise that they own the village hall. I mean,
no.
We try very hard to let people know that.
Yes.
And one thing I find sad is even in the summer holidays, you don't see hundreds of children playing on the play equipment
no.
on Walkfield.
No. When I first got involved with the village hall, it was because I took my son to playgroup because he was 2, and as soon as they found out I'd been involved in a school, they said, because I was a teaching assistant in Leeds, they said, would you come and help? And so I went round to help, and we'd had a complaint from the village hall committee about the playgroup children, and I was asked if I would go to the committee meeting to defend us, basically. And the complaint was just a written complaint about the children causing vandalism, and these were children from 2 to 4. So I went round, and the complaint, and one of the ladies on the committee, who I actually became quite friendly with afterwards, was Richard Kirkland's grandmother. And she was, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying, she was a little bit like the Ina Sharples of the village hall committee. And they said, and I said, well, what exactly is the vandalism? And they pointed up to above the windows, and somebody had written a series of 4-letter words up there. And I said, if they could write it, they couldn't reach it. And they sort of said, oh.
So it didn't occur to the little 4-year-olds.
No, but from that point on, I was on the village hall committee, and so I became, and then with the Allrowas Dramatic Society, I then became chairman. And
so, do you remember the process that sort of they went through to do the original refurb? When they built the toilets at the back. Were you part of that?
Yes,
then?
Brian Hall, Audrey's husband, was an architect, of course, so he drew up the plans, and we got Robert Douglas from Douglas Concrete, who lived locally, came and gave us some money to help do it. And some of it was done by workmen who were brought in because they had to, and that's when the kitchen was built and the toilets at the back. And the stage was moved to the other end. When I first came, the stage was at the opposite end. And so it was quite different, I can remember making the curtains for the stage, and the hall as well. But the stage curtains were huge, and I can still remember how heavy they were. But we had great fun there. And I'm glad it's still going on. I'm glad there's still a thriving dramatic society. Because we then moved to Lichfield and became very involved in Lichfield and Shakespeare in the Park, the Operatic Society. And then Quinton directed the Panto in Lichfield at the Civic Hall for 17 years. So we were very much tied up with that.
Yeah. Wonderful.
So I still have a great attachment for
Good.
all of
Well,
us.
the village hall, we're sort of closing it in September for refurbishment.
Yeah.
So it's taken us a long time to get that.
It is, yes, because that's from the 70s, the early 70s.
That's right, 75. I've got the plans.
Yes, it's taken all that time.
And for the last probably 8 years, it's been in debate whether it gets knocked down, moved here, there, and everywhere. But we've finally now got the money to do the first phase. So it's onwards and upwards.
Is it going to be extended, or is it?
We are.
Because there's not much room to extend.
No, we're going to knock down the.
Do my work at home. I couldn't do that now because there's too much paperwork that requires records that I haven't got at home. So it's changed tremendously.
I think the schools, I've, as you know, done little projects in there and had the 3 lads go through that. I think we're very lucky to have it.
Yes.
And I think sometimes parents don't appreciate that. And if they were to go and see other schools, they'd realise just how good All Saints is.
Yes. I've said that sometimes to staff, if they've had a little grumble. I've said to them, I used to go and do some work for the LEA in schools in Tamworth, in very poor areas, to try and raise the reading standards. And when on the odd occasion, if our staff have had a little grumble, I've said to them, you go work for 6 weeks in a school that's in special measures, then you'll know what pressure is. And when I went to Amington Heath School, and that was sort of, I actually felt very humbled by it because they were in special measures, and what they did with those children, their nurturing was just second to none. They were amazing, and yet they'd constantly got Ofsted at them because they weren't getting the right standards. And I said to the head, it is obscene that their school was measured against the same criteria as our school.
The backgrounds they come from.